Hello, this time on Sitrep, the government's full-scale defence and security review, but it looks like it's not ministers or top brass who are in charge.
We've had 2 defence reviews in the last 3 years and they've gone nowhere. This is the moment to bring in those external reviewers that will work with the internal expertise that's deep in the MOD, in our armed forces.
So who are these outside experts? Is it a good idea or a bad one to put it in their hands? And what can this review do that others have not? Mike and I will talk it through with former Deputy Chief of the General Staff, Lieutenant General Sir Nick Pope. But not everything is waiting for the review.
A bill will be introduced to establish a statutory Armed Forces Commissioner to act as a strong, independent champion for our gallant armed forces and their families.
Sian joins us to explain what that might mean and this.
Measures will be brought forward to begin the process of repealing and replacing the Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Act.
And this week's moment that made me involves dogfighting on 2 wheels.
For the next few hours, we would simply cycle up and down this parade square with one of them yelling 30 starboard, 60 port, and we did all the manoeuvres, basically what I couldn't grasp in the air, without the vertical separation, of course, because we are on bikes and it's not Harry Potter.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Mike, you're a veteran of many defence reviews, not just watching, but you've had input to them as well, haven't you?
A little bit, yes. In the 1998 review, I was responsible for organising these public seminars that we ran from King's College. We had 2 in London, 1 in Coventry, which was as far north as we could persuade the civil service to go to a hotel in Coventry. We couldn't get them any further than that. And I've been involved at RUSI with organising panels and so on. They were pretty peripheral, I have to say. I mean, sometimes they were to show that the MOD was doing it. Other times it was to offer some ideas once the thing was more or less drafted. That's normal. And at one time I remember seeing a copy of the Defence Review, but it was brought in. I think my copy was number 12. And they were all then taken away from us 24 hours later, and it was withdrawn because of a late hitch, and the whole thing was reworked in the following week. And that was kind of interesting to compare what I remembered of the copy I read as opposed to the copy I was then given to keep.
Fascinating. Well, we have our own expert panel for this one. Lieutenant General Sir Nick Pope, also a veteran of many defence reviews. How many is it, Nick?
Well, I think like Michael, I've been involved in defence reviews either directly or indirectly since the 1998 review, mostly as a programmer in the Ministry of Defence and therefore responsible for the corralling of the information coming in. And amusingly, I think I recall handing out item number 12 to Michael many years ago and then recording it back in. So probably mea culpa for that one, Michael.
I forgive you.
Yeah, that's just as well. And Sian Grzeszczyk-Melbourne, a veteran of many editions of Sitrep, is also here. She's also BFBS Forces News' Woman in Westminster. Sian, welcome. Who are these outside experts and what experience do they bring to the job?
Okay, a considerable amount of experience. It's going to be led by Lord Robertson, a former Labour Defence Secretary and NATO Secretary General, so that CV speaks for itself. Then working alongside Lord Robertson will be General Sir Richard Barrons, no stranger to Sitrep, of course, former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, and he was also Commander of Joint Forces Command. He left the military back in 2016. And then there is Fiona Hill, a leading expert on Russia and a former foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump when he was president. Now, if he's re-elected in November, it's an interesting choice because there's no love lost between those two. She testified against him during his impeachment trial.
Yes, it is an interesting lineup, isn't it? What do you think, Nick? Is it good to have outside experts?
I think it's always good to have outside experts to do part of what the review aims to do. I mean, where I'm always interested on reviews is we do spend a lot of time talking about the demand signal in terms of the UK's place in the world, whether or not we should be in the Black Straits or in the South China Sea. But that's one part of the review. The other part is marrying it against the supply side, money, people, the state of the current infrastructure in the UK. And sometimes the alignment process between the demand signal, which takes a long time to to percolate, and the supply signal, I think, is perhaps lacking.
Mike, what do you think about this lineup of outside experts? Does it tell us anything about the direction of this review?
Well, it does in a way, because it was introduced, and John Healey, the Defence Secretary, said the review will be led by Lord Robertson. Now, I don't think he really means that, because the review is led by the Secretary of State. It's his responsibility. And so it was not clear quite what he meant about that. And my understanding is that George Robertson didn't know a whole lot about this until a few days beforehand. I think it was all done quite quickly, because John Healey has been away in Washington. When he announced all of this, it was only his second day in the building, to be honest, and he was announcing something to make it clear that we're not just sitting around thinking about this, we're acting quickly. So it's all been brought together quite quickly. What's different about this review is that they've said, well, these three people, these outside reviewers, will be in it from the beginning at the top level. Now, it will still be directed, of course, by the MOD and by the Secretary of State, but not bringing these people in not as an afterthought or halfway through, but at the very beginning is an attempt to create strategic challenge, I think, to try to ensure that this review is more strategically sensitive than some of the others. All of the reviews we've had, I mean, we can all count them. And I mean, this is the 12th review since the end of the Cold War. It's the 9th review since George Robertson's review of 1998 that Sir Nick was talking about. And most of them are not very strategic. Most of them are cost-cutting exercises and rationalisations. Only a couple of them have been strategic. I think George Robertson's in 98 was, and I think this one has an ambition to be more genuinely strategic. The 2021 integrated review was pretty strategic, but as Sir Nick said, marrying up the strategic vision with the resources is a real problem.
So Nick, have you got any idea or any inside knowledge about how the service chiefs will be feeling about all of this? Will they be feeling sidelined?
There could be a bit of plus de change, I suspect, in the sense that, as Mike points out here, we're no stranger to reviews. And the only thing I would say is that I think John Healey and his ministers have been thinking about this for some time whilst they've been in opposition. So I think it would be fair to say that we've got a review here that has been in genesis for some time. I don't know at all whether George Robertson or Sir Richard Bounds or Fiona were surprised or not about the invitation. It feels quite sharp in terms of timelines. So in terms of genuine consultation, I think we've got quite a tight summer calendar to get after an output here. But that said, you've got three characters who I think, you make the point, Sian, about geopolitics with Fiona, but nonetheless, you've got three characters who are deeply inured in various parts of the departmental business and really understand the background. And rather like other parts of the government reviews, be it in the National Health Service or whatever, you're bringing in experts, therefore, who are not starting from a blank sheet of paper. And maybe that's a good thing.
But Sian, ultimately decisions have to sit with the commanders and ministers and MPs. So where can the lines be drawn exactly? Have you got any inside knowledge on that?
Well, I think we're sitting here at the start of everything from the outside looking in, and you talk to various different people and they've all got opinions on it. I spoke to someone in reaction to it this week and they sort of wondered whether it might be too many cooks and people who have not been at the forefront, who are not in the building at the moment. So we wonder on that. And I think Nick makes a really good point about the timelines as well. The list of people that they want to hear from is quite wide ranging, in the military, out of the military, academia, industry, allies. They're also inviting the likes of me, defence correspondents, to share their thoughts as well. That takes a while to gather, and as Nick said, the timelines for those submissions are quite tight. I think many people were wondering if they might have decided to do a fast-tracked review, but they very much want to take their time, it seems, with this, going methodically through it, injecting a broad church of opinions across the board.
I was interested in what you said about how journalists are also being invited to make their contribution. Any idea what kind of ideas they're looking for?
They're opening everything up to say, what do you think is going to work? What needs to change? And as reporters, you're sort of out on the coalface, you're talking to personnel a lot, you're hearing what they're saying. And so I would imagine they'll probably want a mix of, what's your independent view as someone that's covered defence for a long time? You hear the moans and gripes about accommodation, you're out and about all the time within the military community, and you do get that sense as, what are the burning issues on the ground that some people might not feel comfortable talking to their commanders about. And so I think there is that attempt to just get to the heart of, what needs to happen.
Keir Starmer and John Healey have told us who the panel are, as we've heard, and they called it a NATO First review. Mike, do we really know any more than that?
No, only what John Healey has said in the statements that have been made. But I think the NATO first element is quite important because, we talked in the integrated review in 2021 about a tilt to the Indo-Pacific, and it was only a tilt. It wasn't a major strategic reorientation. But I think the way the situation in Europe has darkened so much in the last couple of years means that making this a NATO first review would be inevitable anyway. And the problem we have is that, we still have a politically interesting voice in NATO, but we don't really have enough military credibility in NATO because of where our armed forces are at the moment. It's very patchy indeed, and the army in particular has got real problems in being able to contribute meaningfully to what NATO needs to do. And so, in a way, saying this is a NATO first review is, in a sense, it's a statement of the obvious, and we've got to actually make ourselves into a more consequential NATO power to play the role that we think will need to be played by all of the main European NATO countries in the next few years.
Okay, so Nick, behind the scenes, how have the reviews that you've been part of, how do they work? What is the process?
I think it's probably fair to say that there's a stage here that we'll go through. So part of it's about the geopolitics and making the ability to make a statement. So the ability to make a statement about being more muscular behind NATO, I think, is frightfully important. But then the ministry will have to get into the mathematics of what that means in terms of force structures and ships and tanks and planes and the like, which will have an implication for the acquisition process, for UK industrial base and the like. And at the same time, there's a people function here. Now, one of the things that comes out early in the defence review is the importance of people central to defence. I was heavily involved in the Haythornthwaite review of armed forces incentivisation last year with Rick Haythornthwaite, the author. And I'd dearly like to see part of this review being about how people are at the heart of delivering a future capability. So aligning the rhetoric with the force structure, with what it means for our kit, with the acquisition process, and the people superimposed on all of that. You'd really be looking for a review which enables us to do that. Because otherwise, we may end up with a really, really good statement of intent, but actually without the will to deliver against it. The other point I would make, and I think it's what we've seen in the early days of this government, is the thought really that they are aiming, or seeming to be aiming, beyond the 5-year time frame. So very much with a longer term strategy, where therefore the delivery against that strategy is going to take a number of years. So somewhere in the area of strategic patience, I think, will be part of the delivery here.
And that sounds like a really sensible move, Mike.
Yes, it does. It's really important. I think the Labour Party, in thinking of itself as an incoming government over the last 12 months, has been thinking very much in those terms. I'm not sure they expected to get such a big majority, but on conventional constitutional practice, you would expect this to be at least a 2-term government and possibly a 3-term government. They've got a good chance of that, given the majority that they've got. So they can now plan with some certainty for at least 8 to 10 years ahead. And that's a sensible thing to do because, defence has really suffered from relatively short-term planning. It's had lots of long-term visions, but only short-term solutions, very often treasury-driven because of the way the money is handled.
And so, Nick, NATO first tag, that's been mentioned a lot, but also national security as well is something that John Healey has been pushing a lot.
Yeah, and I think this is a really intriguing area. And I think General Patrick, before he retires as the chief earlier this year, talked about national resilience. I think unpacking what that really means to a nation that arguably has not had to think existentially for a number of decades, number of centuries, is a really interesting area. So the idea of connectivity with society, of societal engagement, of national resilience, I think is, if it's considered, will be an important adjunct to this idea of NATO and expeditionary.
What is the biggest question the review has to answer? Is it about equipment? Is it about money, recruitment, retention, predicting the next war? What is it?
Well, so for one, it's strategic certainty for me at the sort of the big level of my place, but actually at my grubby level, it's all about people. So unless we have an armed forces that is able to recruit and retain sufficient quality individuals to do the jobs required of them, then it's a gloomy place. And I think we would all agree that most Western nations right now are struggling with this conundrum. So to me, people are central to defence, and the more it can underpin that, the better.
And Mike, how will you judge whether it's been a success or not?
Well, for me personally, I think there's two things I'd be looking for. One is what the review says and implies about the war in Ukraine, because that is the existential problem that we all face. If British defence policy is to meet the challenge for the next decade, we have to meet that challenge first. And then the second aspect, which is related to that, is I know John Healey's thought much more about trying to make defence more central to government, not just a department of government that spends a lot of money, but more central to the psychology of British government than it has been over the last 40, 50 years. And if the review can take a significant step or steps in that direction, then I think we might look back on it as a good piece of work.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about other things that shouldn't wait. Nick, you mentioned the Haythornthwaite review that you were part of armed forces incentivisation last year, and you made 67 recommendations. I mean, can they realistically be getting on with those while they're carrying out a defence review?
It's interesting. We had a tsunami of reviews hit the Ministry of Defence last year. You had the Etherton report on the historic hurt, the LGBT plus community. You had the Veterans Welfare Service review, the quinquennial review of the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme, and of course the big one, the Haythornthwaite review. And in my day job now as chair of the Charities Commission, Service Charities Commission, of the 200 odd recommendations that those four reviews delivered, I think 67 or so are pertinent to the veterans community in the charity area. So you've got a massive issue now. If you're in defence and you're sitting on the 6th floor as a people person, how do you possibly turn what are great recommendations into programmes of action and delivery at the same time as you think about the strategic defence review? Of course, the two are linked. The two are actually inextricably part of the same solution space. So somehow, defence is going to have to get its head around what it means. On the Haythornthwaite area specifically, it's going to require potentially primary and secondary legislation. So we are actually thinking now about, we've got an armed forces bill coming up in a year or two's time, and how do you get the policy and the legislation together to deliver strategic change? I would argue that unless we do this, defence is never going to get the recruitment and retention of young men and women into the 21st century correct. So it's going to be a very, very busy Ministry of Defence over the next 5 years or so.
It certainly is. And on that subject of retention and recruitment, I mean, one of the things that the service personnel really care about is their accommodation. And we talked about it briefly earlier. Sian, I mean, is there any promise to do anything about that right now?
Well, that's exactly what I asked the new Armed Forces Minister, Luke Pollard, as well as the Defence Secretary over the last couple of weeks. Luke Pollard said that immediate steps will be taken. Announcements are going to be made very soon. His version of very soon and our version of very soon, I'm not quite sure, when that precisely will be. But I then pressed John Healey on this as well. He said, we're not going to sit back and simply wait for the review recommendations to report. So personnel will probably be quite pleased and relieved to hear that it's not going to be kicked into 2025. And he talked to me about, recruitment, retention, acknowledging that crisis that is facing not just, our armed forces, but across the world. And he said there are a number of things that we must decide and deal with in advance of and alongside the reviewers doing their work. But we still don't have that specific timeline on when personnel can expect change. I've been talking to a lot of them over the last week, and that is the big key question. It's what is going to change and when? And they're just so tired of all those calls to Pinnacle, trying to get work done on their houses and not really seeing a change.
So, Nick, a lot of that very familiar to you?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, where I would push really hard here is the importance of family. Rather than just service personnel, because if all the evidence we got in the Haythornthwaite review was unless you start to think about service through the prism of family and therefore spousal employment, accommodation, the mobility of the military and what that means for the family community and family cohesion. Unless you start to get after those kind of issues, then actually retention is a problem.
And we heard in the King's speech, Mike, the government wants to repeal and replace the Act which conditionally put an end to troubles-related prosecutions in Northern Ireland. That's reopening a can of worms, isn't it?
Well, potentially it is, but it's a can of worms in any case. And what we want to know is what's the replace bit? What are they going to replace it with? In a way, all governments have to struggle with this one. And I suspect, not being overly cynical, that this will go on with legislative arrangements which don't quite work until the whole thing passes out of living memory, which is in a way of saying that all governments play for time on this, because there's no way of reconciling the competing demands that go back to the Troubles, which, remember, started in 1969. We're talking about people who are in their 80s now being questioned about things that happened when they were in their early 20s. It becomes impossible to reconcile.
I think this is one where it's about strategic containment. I remember serving in Bosnia in the 90s, where the local communities remembered and celebrated the Battle of the Crows from 1389. So if you've got a psychological framework where you are deeply rooted in history, it's multi-generational before you can really start thinking about a change in the national psyche. So I think that the only thing available to government really is to try and contain and put its political arms around what is actually a very, very difficult situation.
There was a story then that on the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 that a young man was telling a journalist all about it, and the journalist said, "But that happened centuries ago," and the young man said, "Yeah, but I only found out about it last week."
Well, the other military matter addressed in the King's speech is the creation of an Armed Forces Commissioner who would report to Parliament rather than ministers or the chain of command. Sian, how will this be different from the Armed Forces Complaints Ombudsman that we already have?
Well, the government says the remit of the existing ombudsman is too narrow. So the ombudsman can only look into individual complaints following completion of the service complaints process. Their remit is reactive, they say, and so does not allow proactive investigations into issues facing the armed forces. Now, the Defence Secretary told me that this commissioner would be allowed to access sites, access information without the say-so of the Defence Secretary beforehand. So he's talking about scenarios where they could turn up to a base and theoretically they'd have the power to be allowed straight in unannounced. So not even a sort of Ofsted scenario, if they're hearing on the ground from military spouses, from serving personnel or anyone else who's come direct to them and they're spotting a pattern, then he's saying that, they will have that level of authority to be able to go straight in there, but also to report directly to Parliament and therefore giving them a much higher profile.
Well, we're waiting for the detail to be set out, but we do know Labour have been looking to the German Armed Forces Commissioner for inspiration. Eva Hergel visited to meet the then shadow defence team last summer, and she also spoke to Sitrep about her role as an advocate with Access All Areas.
Soldiers are, as we call it, citizens in uniform. So they have rights, and these rights should be guaranteed. I'm fully free of how I investigate certain issues. Their exercises, their equipment, infrastructure is one of my main issues I look at. So the accommodation, I think it's a question of respect to have accommodation in a good state. As I call myself an advocate for the soldiers, I cannot decide myself, but I then tell the Minister of Defense or the parliamentarians, or I announce it in the public what I found and what I think should be improved. When I went to Lithuania to see the German soldier, that was 2 days before the invasion of the Russian in Ukraine, and it was 3 degrees cold and snowing, and the German soldiers told me that they don't have enough winter clothes with their uniform. And I was sort of, astonished to hear this and to see them sleeping in a tent, cold outside and snowing. And then I made a public announcement of this. I told the highest ranking officers. I told the minister, and I also said it in the media that was what I found. And then immediately everyone tried to make it possible that the German soldiers there get winter clothes.
Well, let's get some thoughts from Sarah Atherton now, a veteran of the Army's Intelligence Corps who sat on the Commons Defence Committee during her 5 years as a Conservative MP. She led their special inquiry into the experiences of women in the armed forces. Good to see you, Sarah. So, an Armed Forces Commissioner, good or bad idea?
Thank you for having me. A good idea, and it's something that is much needed within our armed forces. And I'm saying that having had 5 years of experience of championing the needs of our armed forces here in the UK.
And what powers do you think the Commissioner should have, and where should the lines in restricting their power be drawn?
For the Commissioner to do good work, the Commissioner has to be independent, and that's always going to be difficult because the Commissioner is going to be commissioned by a body, but they have to be independent and they have to hold their core value firmly in place, and that core value should be the voice, the representation and the advocate for our armed forces and their families. And that's quite a difficult task to maintain, because not only are they an advocate for armed forces, which is much needed given how demoralised our armed forces are and how they're actually hemorrhaging. We are losing so many personnel. Recruitment is improving, but we are losing experienced personnel at a rapid rate of knots that it is, in my opinion, impacting on operational effectiveness. So this is why the Commissioner's role is much needed. But they need to also act as an advocacy and policy influencing role for the MOD and the ministers.
And how much difference do you think then an Armed Forces Commissioner could actually make in reality?
It cannot be tokenistic. We have seen in the MOD, in the military, they implement policies, for example, the zero tolerance policy, and it's more tokenistic, and that will actually backfire. So if this role is given teeth, if it really can influence ministers and the MOD, and that is a challenge, it can do significant good, and it must do good. I mean, as the previous Secretary of State said, we're in a pre-war, not post-war era. We have capability gaps within our equipment, and we have the lowest morale and the lowest numbers of military personnel going forward. So this is a role, actually, that is much needed.
Ultimately, though, the decisions have to sit with the commanders, the ministers and MPs. So where should the lines be drawn exactly?
Whoever takes this Commissioner role on must walk a fine line, because they need to hold firm why they're there, and that is to support our military personnel, but they need to be able to influence the key players in this field. If they can't do that or unable to do that, then again the role is tokenistic. So it will take whoever the Commissioner is a lot of interpersonal skills to be able to achieve that.
Governments of both colours have had their reasons for resisting calls for such a powerful watchdog until now. Why do you think this new Labour government has given it the green light?
I think they are wide-eyed and very alert to the fact that the military cannot go on like it is. We saw problems with equipment like the Ajax. We've seen accommodation equipment. We've seen all the work I've undertaken with women in the military, the abuse of power, the service justice system. No one has faith in that anymore, and it's got to a pinch point. It's got to a point where something has to happen. And the new Labour administration have been quite open with me for a number of months now that this is a role they want to take on, and I endorse what they're doing.
Well, that was the former Conservative MP, Sarah Atherton. Sarah's a veteran like you, Nick. Do you agree with her that it's a good idea? And how do you think it will be going down with the chain of command?
Can I call it an interesting idea? Because I think that what we've had is an announcement, but there's a lot of work now between a political statement, which I think is interesting and intriguing, and actually the delivery against that statement. And I suspect what's going on inside the Ministry of Defence right now is an awful lot of thinking as to the options you have for an Armed Forces Commissioner. We heard words there about boundary conditions to do with responsibility and accountability and authority to whom in the areas of policy creation, of service delivery and of lived experience. And a new commissioner and the team that surround them will face a break in battle, because they are moving into a space where the MOD and other government departments understandably will find it uncomfortable to have their homework checked, to be held to account. That said, it's been announced and it is in the King's Speech, and we can now expect whoever he or she is to come in and have to start to flex muscles. It's going to be awkward for ministers of the Ministry of Defence, I think, to find themselves held to account by Parliament. And I think it's bringing Parliament, potentially the House of Commons Defence Committee, much more muscularly into the frame than potentially we've had for the last couple of decades. So I'm going to be really interested as to how that happens. And my last point, I suppose, will be, golly, this is quite a challenging role. And whoever he or she may be as a potential candidate, I think it's a real test of whether somebody's got the political nous and political acumen, the military understanding, and the empathy to pick up on lived experience across not only service personnel but families, and potentially into those who have served, so the armed forces community writ large.
Well, let's just finish with some final thoughts on the overall defence review. Sian, Labour's made a big play of delivering change, but they're also being very clear there really isn't any more money right now.
Exactly, Kate. And the Prime Minister is continuing to face criticism for refusing to guarantee, when he's going to meet this cast iron commitment to increase defence spending to 2.5%. I was in the Commons yesterday. The leader of the opposition, Rishi Sunak, was piling on that pressure for Keir Starmer to make that commitment and match what they had said in the run-up to the election to do it by 2030. That pressure is not going away. Will they make us wait for the results of the review, or might they include it in Rachel Reeves' first budget as Chancellor? We wait to see.
Mike, do you think it will deliver anything different from the 4 reviews we've had in the last decade?
Yeah, it's even, if you count the 2 reviews that appeared in 2017, it's 5 reviews in the last decade, depending on how you think about that sort of shenanigans of 2017. But I certainly hope it does. I think it will. Partly because, one, is we all agree that the defence can't carry on the way it has done for the last 20 or 30 years as a way of allocating resources to meet strategic challenges. It's not working, and it's running out of rope, effectively. And the other reason why it's got to work is because our immediate threat environment has changed more in the last 2 or 3 years than at any time in the last 70 years. And so both for internal and external reasons, this review has got to make a bigger impact than most previous reviews.
What about you, Nick? Where are you on the dial? Optimistic or pessimistic about the path ahead for the armed forces and for defence?
So I think this gives the new government the opportunity to set their long-term strategic aims for the military function in place over a 10-year programme. If I was to sit in a previous guise, when I was a baby brigadier in the Ministry of Defence, working on the 10-year programme, you work against a budgetary assumption, and then you work out within that budgetary assumption how much you can allocate to people and to kit and to what type of kit and the like over a 10-year period, because it takes that long to generate military capability. And when I took over, my job was titled to deliver a balanced, coherent and affordable long-term programme for defence. But I realised after the first year that wasn't quite right. My job was to deliver options to ministers to deliver a balanced, coherent and affordable long-term programme. This is ultimately political choice. It's for the politics to work out our ambition in the world and how we resource it. And Sean, your point about reaching into ministers to say, at what stage are you going to make that resource envelope more clear, will enable those people in the ministry whose job it is to work out numbers of ships, tanks and planes and drones and the like to allocate programmes of change to deliver them. So it's a really, really important area to give financial certainty to programming.
Lieutenant General Sir Nick Pope, Sian Grzeszczyk-Melbourne, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Now, we finish with another Moment That Made Me, our series of inspiring stories from military careers. Well, this time it's Mandy Hickson's moment. She would go on to become the RAF's second ever female fighter pilot. But on the 20th of August, 1998, it was the eve of a make or break exam. Mandy was struggling, and her friends were about to offer some unorthodox help.
I was flying the Hawk T-Mark 1, so not very much technology on board that aeroplane. None of what you see today when we've got the sort of head-up displays and moving maps. We basically had a stopwatch, paper map and a compass. And yeah, a young pilot basically going through her fast jet training, and I was starting to struggle a lot. And starting to lose my confidence. Things were getting harder and harder, and we were doing something called tactical low level, where a formation of 2 aeroplanes head off at very low level, so 250 feet, the height of a pylon, travelling at speeds normally around 420 knots, but sometimes accelerating up to, just below 500 for target runs. And you're sticking with your wingman at all times as a pair of aeroplanes, primarily because the instructors are also basically the enemy up there, and they're trying to simulate coming behind you into your 6 o'clock position to simulate shooting you down with an air-to-air missile. And you have one blind spot when you're flying, it's directly behind your jet. So if you're an individual, you're almost guaranteed to fail. But if you've got a wingman there, you've got someone who can provide that mutual support that can check your 6 as well. In fact, not just behind you, but in fact, all around you. But it means you must coordinate your turns. You can't just be coming up for a turn to the left and just think, I'm off, because then your wingman is behind you. You're both vulnerable and you're exposed. And so this takes a lot of planning. And so if you're turning to the right, for example, both aeroplanes will pull up. You will then go towards each other and cross at a perpendicular angle of exactly 90 degrees before you then roll out onto the new heading. And then you're in perfect formation. And that's when I was failing. I was so caught up in the numbers and the minutiae that I was just not seeing the bigger picture.
And just tell me a little bit more about that moment on the 20th of August, 1998, because presumably you were failing and things were coming to a head, and you maybe had this thought going on in your head, it's becoming self-fulfilling. They set me up to fail and I'm about to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sitting in my room, I had a chop ride the following morning. There's a knock on my door. It's a course mate. And he said, Mandy, we're taking you out this evening. And I thought, absolutely not. Why on earth would I go out celebrating the fact that they all finished, drinking beers or whatever when I've got the chop ride the next day? And he said, no, you need to trust me. And he took me to the bike sheds, and obviously the trust waned at that point. But we got onto our bikes and we cycled to the other side of the airfield, and there waiting on all of their bikes were the remaining members of my course. And for the next few hours, we would simply cycle up and down this parade square with one of them yelling 30 starboard, 60 port. And we did all the manoeuvres in the air. Sorry, we did them all on the ground, basically what I couldn't grasp in the air. Without the vertical separation, of course, because we are on bikes and it's not Harry Potter. And everything fell into place for me. And it was this moment in time whereby ultimately I recognised the power of the team, and the support that I had from my teammates, my course mates, my wingmen was phenomenal, because it's that feeling of selflessness, of coming together. And they went the extra mile when there was absolutely nothing whatsoever to gain themselves, because you built up that level of trust and that level of camaraderie. And also they gave me this amazing different cognitive diversity. We always talk about diversity in teams, but they gave me a different perspective. I'd been practicing it in the same way, doing the same thing, getting the same results. And suddenly they said, let's think about this outside the box. Let's think of it in a very different way. And suddenly that framing of it just gave a completely different perspective of my learning. And that was the moment that made me.
And if you can just take me back to the moment you went down to those bike sheds, you got the bike out and you're getting on the bike, what was going through your head? Did you think this is ridiculous?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. What on earth are we doing? Are we cycling to a pub? That's what I actually thought. And he said, please just trust me. We've had a great idea. And it was just that, what on earth is happening? And then to see all the rest of my course mates all waiting, it was a summer, it was August of 1998, and it was, twilighty in the air. And of course you get those summer nights in Anglesey. Oh, it's like a movie, isn't it? It was a bit like a movie, because you could imagine we're all cycling around in this beautiful sort of sunsetting, environment.
So how long did you cycle around the parade ground for?
It was definitely a couple of hours until things felt more natural for me. And I think I'm very, I wouldn't say binary, but I love a plan, and I like to have all the numbers written down, and I've worked out the degrees. And that's what I was focusing on, was the wrong thing. And they recognised that these turns that we were doing, it's more of a visual perspective. And if you were to practice it on your bikes, you would pick up the actual feeling of the turns. And just looking at the bigger picture to see how do you cross over and then where do you roll out. And suddenly it meant that your head is now out of the cockpit. You're not in the cockpit at low level, which is incredibly dangerous to be. You know, they say it should be sort of 95% out the cockpit and just scanning what's going on inside. And I think that they just had the idea to do that. And when I flew the trip the next day, and it went really well, my instructor just said to me, wow, that was like flying with a different pilot. What on earth has happened? And I told him about what the guys had done, and he just said, wow, that's unbelievable, you know. And so it's never about them and us. It's about the team together.
And what a career you've had. Service in Iraq, 3 tours of duty, more than 40 missions flown. How do you reflect on that?
I think I'm very lucky. I feel honoured to have had the opportunity to do that at a time where there was a real changing of the guard, where women were being allowed for the very first time to fly on the front line of operations. Had the wonderful Jo Salter who'd led the way for us. I just think I'm blessed to have been in the right time at the right place and been given the opportunities that I've been given. And I think when I look back now, I think that is what is important to me now is that legacy of change, that we've made it so much easier for others to follow in our footsteps.
And tell me a little bit about your experience, the time when you narrowly missed a surface-to-air missile.
Yeah, that was a little bit of a nervous moment, should we say. I was flying, about to recover back to base. We were just quite near the Kuwait border when we're in an area which had been very benign up to that area time. Nothing had ever happened in the 3 months preceding it. And suddenly my navigator just yelled, "Mandy, brake right." And basically, when you're normally engaged by a surface-to-air missile in a theatre of war, you will pick up a lot of information on your your radar homing and warning receiver, your RHWR, which is a piece of equipment in the Tornado, which gives us a spike to tell us that there's a radar on the ground looking at us. If a missile is sent in a heat-seeking mode, which is really unusual, you won't get any advance warning. And as he was looking, he just had his night vision goggles on and he turned to the right and he just saw this flash and then the igniters of the missile locking in. And that's when he yelled to me to brake right. We did the manoeuvre we've practiced so many times before, but never obviously for real. And we put the flares out at the exact moment I chilled my engines. And we watched a missile go from being locked onto us to pulling off on our flares to exploded a few miles away. And I'll be honest, it was probably the closest I've ever come to losing my life. But also it makes you realise just how important the training that we'd had. Because he said what he said, and we practiced it, it meant that actually we could do an action that was immediate, a measured response, as opposed to just reacting to something, haphazardly.
Do you think the manoeuvre you had to perform there had you been able to use what you learnt on that parade ground to help you in that situation? Was there a link?
Yeah. So, I mean, interestingly, when you're flying over in Iraq, we were always in battle. I mean, we weren't at low level. For us, it was a medium level war. But we always fly in battle formation. So even if you're doing the turns, you're still turning in your battle formation, which was the basis. And that's why it was so important to get it right at Valley, that fast jet training, because every single thing that you're going to do from that moment onwards will, at low level flying or medium level, if you're flying as a pair of aircraft, which you nearly always are, for that mutual support, you will always be turning down to tactical battle turns. So yeah, it's the basis of everything.
And that was over Iraq. And it's interesting that you say that is the closest you came to losing your life. And yet you didn't choose that as the moment that made you. You chose the cycling on the parade ground.
Yeah, there's been many moments where things have happened, where you have emergencies. And I do believe, although they stick as moments in your life, it wasn't the moment that made me. I learned a lot about myself. I learned about decision making under pressure. I learned about fear of failure, of letting my team down. I'd learned about leadership, not my own, my bosses that night. But the moment that made me is the moment that actually enabled me to have the career I've had. And I think often the moment that makes us is the moment where we have support from other people. And it's not just about our actions, but it's about coming together as a whole.
Mike, really fascinating talking to Mandy there. And one of the things that really came across to me, that she was there with this make or break exam, and she was in the detail. She was struggling with it. And all it took was thinking outside the box, going back to some simplicity from her fellow course mates. And the problem was solved rather simply.
Yeah, and what she was talking about, cycling around the parade ground, reminded me, as she was saying it, the accounts of Cat's Eyes Cunningham and Roger Chisholm, who was the night fighter aces in the Second World War. And they said as part of the training, they were on three-wheeler bikes that were all sort of enclosed in sort of canvas, and they had to cycle round a football pitch trying to locate each other. And they said they just couldn't do it for laughing most of the time. And this is what they did in the Second World War on bicycles to try to practice manoeuvres when they were blacked out, but the blackout didn't work, so I think you could all see where each other's were, and the whole thing was ridiculous. But in Mandy's case, the thing that really came through listening to that, and again, it's a great way of great listen, was this strength of unit loyalty to one of their members. And it also tells us quite a lot about women on the front line. Women in frontline roles get the same unit loyalty as everybody else. That was what I took away from her story. And you know, the strength of that unit loyalty, you don't get that anywhere else than in the armed forces. It's stronger there than any other part of British society that I have ever seen.
Yeah, it's why people miss it so much when they leave, isn't it?
They do. And very often they can't understand why that unit loyalty doesn't apply. And there's something rather special. It's partly because of what the armed forces do and the risks that they take. But that strength, it's that, as she said, that's what keeps you going. Everybody in the unit wants everybody else to do well and to be safe. And so they'll go the extra mile every time in order to make that happen. It constantly impresses me and moves me when I see that again and again in the armed forces.
Absolutely. Professor Michael Clarke, good to speak to you. Thank you so much. And we'll be back next week with another Sitrep. Until then, you can always catch up with past programmes you might have missed online at bfbs.com/sitrep, the Forces News YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.